Hi everyone. I thought I would read you a really good introduction to an edition of Twelfth Night that I found, and this is actually my original edition of Twelfth Night. So I thought I'd read it to you. I'll give you a copy as well, but it's quite densely worded, so it's perhaps easier to listen to and follow along than just read off the page. So, Introduction to Twelfth Night. It's by Claire Mackern. A playgoer in Shakespeare's time who attended a performance of Twelfth Night would have encountered, much as we do, a play whose plot turns on the pleasurable mistakes into which love can lead a person. Viola is a plucky young woman, shipwrecked and separated from her twin brother, and cast ashore in a strange country, disguises herself as a young woman in order to enter the service of the local duke. The Duke employs this page as an emissary to the woman he loves, a woman who has sworn not to love, but rather to mourn her own recently dead brother. However, confronted with the impassioned pleas of the emissary, who has fallen in love with her master and thus knows whereof she speaks when it comes to the pangs of love, the disdainful woman falls in love with Viola, now named Cesario, and enters into her own plight of unrequited passion. This impasse is unknotted only by the arrival of the twin brother, who happily marries the lady and brings to light the true gender identity of his sister. The Duke then considers marriage to his page, whose devotions he has often heard sworn. The nominal themes of the play are then the questions of why and how and whom people love and how they respond to the experience of longing. Unlike us, however, the playgoer may have sensed some connection between the play's obvious romantic concerns and other more supernatural mysteries. These were mysteries brought into being by the most profound cultural change of the 16th century, that from Catholicism to Protestantism in England's national religion. Perhaps most pressing among the reverberations of this shift were not ideological or political questions, but practical and emotional ones. How was God to be worshipped? How were sins to be acknowledged and remedied? And how was salvation itself to be hoped for? These questions and the emotions that they summon resonate with the errant longings dramatized in Shakespeare's comedy. For instance, whether in thinking about the history of the world or the history of their own lives, 16th century believers would, like Twelfth Night's characters, have confronted a story in which a temporary confusion about identity was resolved by revelation of the truth. The Christian history of the world had always been framed as a period of earthly confusion and error set to rights by the Last Judgment, the moment when all true values were determined. When the meek, for example, however heretofore underestimated, might inherit the earth. The individual experienced this confusion as a mystery, conquering his or her own salvation, an ultimate destination, heaven or hell. A mystery sustained throughout the individual's lifetime and resolved only, presumably after his or her own death. This Christian story urged that the material world, where what usually mattered was the satisfaction of one's carnal desires, might not be an accurate guide to the celestial system of measuring value. Success on earth might count against you in heaven, whereas earthly misery might prepare the way for heavenly bliss. The introduction of Protestantism in the 16th century increased the extent of mystery in this story. Under Catholicism, salvation had been a matter of following a certain set of clear rules, such as doing good work, and making sure spiritual debts were paid and absolved and truly repented at the moment of death. Hence, confession, pardons, and other protocols for spiritual laundering. When Protestants abolished such practices and developed the theology of salvation based solely on the gift of God's grace to the sinner, in other words, not based on the sinner's own efforts, it became harder to measure how one was faring salvation-wise. A person who took his or her salvation seriously at this time was in for a potentially rather anxious experience. For instance, Was worldly fortune, such as material prosperity or success in romance, a sign that God had favoured you, a sampling of delights to come in the afterworld? Or was it in fact a sign that you kept company with earthly temptations, and were hence damned? Were difficulties, uh, where difficulty marks, sorry, were difficulties marks of disfavour or opportunities to show your spiritual mettle? How is a person to interpret the world around her as a guide of her spiritual destiny? How could one judge the fitness of one's own desires, whether for earthly or heavenly rewards? Should one hope, fear, trust, suspect? Theologians of the period were divided not only on how a person could know whether he or she was destined for heaven, but whether it was appropriate to even ask. The influential French reformer Jean Calvin, for instance, thought it essentially impudent to attempt to ascertain God's plan for you, while the English theologian Richard Hooker thought that if you were worried about whether you were saved, then chances were you probably were. Anxiety itself was a good sign, doubt giving you benefit of the doubt. The only consensus was pretty much that either extreme, utter confidence in one's own election or utter despair about it, was a bad idea. The one led to a dangerous smugness or elitism, the other led to disregard for law and order. This is the world of Twelfth Night, a play that offers characters at sea with the mysterious signs of the world and asks what the proper attitude is towards our own longings for rewards. Some of its resonances with these matters are quite specific. We can, for instance, find representatives of both categories of spiritual error. In the two antagonists of the play's subplot, Malvolio, the presumptuous steward, and Sir Toby Belch, his chief antagonist and tormentor, the one is called a kind of Puritan, Puritan being a blanket term in this period for religious extremists, dissatisfied with what they considered the insufficiently reformed state of the national church, and more than usually convinced of their own ethical worth. The unruly knight, on the other hand, is seemingly concerned only with physical pleasures, cakes and ale. Malvolio's opinion of himself is too high, while Sir Toby seems insufficiently preoccupied with gratifications beyond the immediate. While this play sets the two figures at odds with each other, in English social life, both Puritans and libertines, were equally disruptive, in that neither respected the orders and hierarchies based in caste that dictated that the socially noble were also the ethically noble. However, we needn't be so specific or even so serious in our search for the play's cultural resonance. Twelfth Night is not explicitly a religious play, and it is a play that cautions against reading into things. Not so good for us. But it is at the very least a play that foregrounds the experience of longing and the nature of its objects, reasons, and mistakes. The universe of the play is overrun by errant desires founded on mistaken identities. The most far-reaching of these stems from a disguise, that of the heroine Viola as a boy. As in Shakespeare's Source, Barnaby Rich's Apollonius and Scylla, which was a 1581 play, this disguise is a practical one, both protective and liberating. Yet, in Illyria, Viola stumbles into a world awry at the highest levels, where errors deriving from psychological misconceptions precede and prepare for those caused by her disguise. For instance, the most desirable heiress, Olivia, refuses to return the affections of the most desirable bachelor, Orsino, a stalemate that offers itself as an obstacle that this comedy must overcome. Furthermore, Olivia has sworn to moor her recently dead brother for 7 years. Compounding her perversity is the fact that she rules only tenuously over her household. The only male authority figure is her drunken uncle, himself largely keen on using her status as a wealthy heiress to fleece potential suitors of their money to serve his own appetites. Even her deceased father's fool cannot be kept to heel. Viola's arrival only compounds and further confounds the state of misdirected longings that exist between Orsino and Olivia. And to this trio of confused lovers we can add Malvolio, the sea captain, Antonio, Sir Toby, and even Sir Andrew Aguecheek. Malvolio is duped into thinking his mistress Olivia wishes to make love to her. Wishes him to make love to her. Antonio, in love with the twin brother Sebastian, is led by Cesario's failure to recognise him, which he interprets as a refusal to acknowledge him, into thinking his affections even more unrequited than they probably are. Sir Toby is usually too drunk to recognise that the maidservant Maria carries a torch for him, and even Sir Andrew, egged on by Sir Toby, briefly thinks that he has a shot at Olivia. It is the latter's only redeeming quality that he has enough sense to realise he's not in the running. But errors about whom one loves and who loves one back are not the only kind of errors in the play. Viola is obviously exempt from the erotic errors due to her disguise. She, along with the audience, is mostly in the privileged position of realising the mistakes of others, and she alone seems humbly unambitious in accepting that her love for Orsino will go both unrequited and largely unspoken. But even Viola is not exempt from the general climate of midsummer madness. For instance, she is led astray by the alleged swordsmanship of Sir Andrew, as he is about hers, a mistake about manhood at least. She is further nonplussed by Antonio's mistaking her for her brother, and on a more serious level she is wrong about the alleged death of her brother, and as Sebastian is about hers. So too the fool Feste points out to his mistress Olivia that she is wrong to mourn her own truly dead brother, who, if in heaven rather than hell or this vale of tears, ought to be the object of celebration. The response to earthly loss and to the consequent misunderstandings of Providence is perhaps the most fundamental and metaphysical error that the play addresses. But even Feste, who seems to intuit something fishy about Viola's disguise, usually possesses the poised gaze of the outside observer, is flummoxed by Sebastian's arrival on the scene into the same condition of confusion as everyone else. He says, "Nothing that is so is so." Pretty much the only characters in Twelfth Night who don't labour under some delusion are the servants, Maria and Fabian. Characters are mistaken about themselves as well as others. In fact, mistakes about others usually begin at home. Olivia first asserts that she is immune to love, and then that she can make Cesario love her, even if it means bribing him. Orsino, just as willful, is convinced that he will prevail in his suit, and sends jewels to Olivia in the service of that cause. Antonio's otherwise enigmatic insistence that Sebastian takes his purse falls into the same category of gifts. The self-absorbed desire of a lover to elbow his way past obstacles also describes Malvolio. Indeed, while Olivia accuses Malvolio of being sick of self-love, the description fits many of the characters as well, except strikingly Viola, who, as a twin in the position to know that selves are not necessarily so special. Paradoxically, however, hers is the most original voice in the play, in terms of the poetry Shakespeare writes for her. Self-love and its corollary, conviction that other people can and should share your affliction, seems a nearly universal illness that contributes a great deal to the hallucinatory world in which these characters find themselves. Twinship is thus not only a biological fact in this play, but also a metaphor for the way in which we all have in common a self often blindly insistent on the furtherance of its own will. For the most part, Shakespeare seems to argue for a lenient take on longing. We can be misguided and inappropriate in our pursuits of our wills, but not, for the most part, any more so than the next person, and ultimately Providence will do its best to set us straight. literally in the case of Olivia. Take, for example, the difference between Viola and Olivia's respective responses to love. Both women have lost brothers, in another instance of human twinship. Viola, for instance, knows her brother may well be dead, but does not allow the knowledge to prevent her from choosing life. In fact, she extrapolates the possibility of his survival from her own and allows herself to choose love despite the possibility of further loss or even lack of reciprocity. Her resilience could appear as heartless or even fickle or even impudent in its disregard for the temporary nature of earthly happiness, except it doesn't, for she seems, fittingly, buoyant. Of course, the experience of love she embarks on is hardly without its elements of loss, or even of self-protection. She loves a man in love with another woman, who doesn't even know that she, Viola, is a woman. But it is her doubly hopeless experience of love that renders her love language alone authentic. Hers is an exorbitant yearning that sunders the conventions of Petrarchan desire, the trite set text of Orsino's bosom, through the sheer force of her passion. Much as Olivia is drawn, despite her vows to Viola Cesario's sincerity, so Viola is the audience's touchstone of truth as well, the protagonist with whom we are most asked to identify. We, the audience, always know who she is, even more than she does. In that, as of Act 2, Scene 1, we know that her brother is still alive, and hence that her psychological buoyancy is warranted and just, not impertinent, but rather full of faith. Olivia, by contrast, under the double burden of the recent losses of her brother and father, initially appears unwilling to risk any further casualties, the kind that loving might involve. While this disregard for earthly delights might seem an insistence of spiritual good posture, it also demonstrates a kind of presumptuous contempt for both the world's bounties and its necessities. She is, in essence, impolite. Orsino, in fact, calls her, "you uncivil lady," especially as it is not a very sincere abstinence. The greed with which she pursues and falls on Cesario Sebastian reveals her merely as a familiar comic type, the disdainer of love forced to recant. But to the extent that her fruitless pining serves to correct and balance her previous disdain, we allow her to pass relatively uncensored. Olivia's final cry of "most wonderful" at the sight of two husbands at once seems to bespeak a natural, dully apprised of sense of the world's bounty. Both of these love experiences offer instances of a kind of chastisement, of characters being made to suffer for love before being rewarded with it. Adding to their rebuke is the fact that the characters' rewards are not precisely the ones that they had imagined for themselves. Most of the play's other lovers are also forgivable, and probably because they too are humbled in the course of the plot, forced to renounce their own willfulness and self-love. Orsino's desire for Olivia, for instance, is arrogant and formulaic. We are told, by Olivia no less, that he is eminently attractive. But he also knows it. He's in love with the love lifestyle, convinced that she will love him eventually, certain that he knows everything there is to know about women, that female longing is inferior to male, and that he cannot and will not countenance Olivia's rejection of his suit. He is wrong about all of this, and hence Olivia's insistent refusals are quite satisfying to the audience. In Viola, he gets more than he deserves, but we're willing to give him that. Probably because for Viola's sake, we give him the benefit of the doubt. Like those couples where one partner's appeal legislates for the elusive redeeming qualities of the other. Besides, when it comes to love, who doesn't get more than they deserve? To these three humiliations we can add Antonio's. His deflected love for Sebastian is truly pathetic and literally life-threatening, much like Viola's. Actually, in one of the play's many twinships of the spirit, and he of these four is the only one who does not ultimately gain some consolation prize, apart from his life. The others all get something extra, even if it is not what they expected, such as the imprecise, if well-meaning bounty of comic providence, whose grace often consists in delivering not what you think you want, but what you might not know that you need. The play's treatment of stubborn and self-involved lovers is then largely a forgiving and even festive one. Shakespeare makes this festive quality quite explicit in the play's title. In Renaissance Europe, the 12th night of Christmas holiday season fell on January 6th, the feast of the Epiphany. This day celebrated the moment in the Christmas story where the three wise men arrived to present their gifts to the infant Christ. It was a day both of revelation and restoration, commemorating the moment when Christ's birthday was fully revealed to the entirety of the world, and his status as the one true Lord recognised by the homage of temporal rulers. Like the pagan celebrations of the winter solstice, onto which the Christian calendar grafted its own winter festivities, the Epiphany marked the paradoxical presence of light amid darkness. The calendrical twin of Twelfth Night is Shakespeare's play of the summer solstice, A Midsummer Night's Dream. The people of England, Shakespeare's England, celebrated Twelfth Night with games, masquerades, entertainments, and indeed plays. Often, the normal social rules governing rank and gender were temporarily suspended during these activities. In fact, while Twelfth Night was first printed in 1623, the first folio of Shakespeare's plays, it was probably written in 1600 or 1601. For one of the earliest records of its performances comes from the contemporary report of a young lawyer named John Manningham, who saw the play performed during the midwinter feast of Candlemas in 1602 in the banqueting hall of the Middle Temple, a London law school. Candlemas was a holiday 40 days after Christmas, one of the last feasts of the winter holiday season prior to the arrival of the Lenten abstinence. The Feast of the Epiphany was, in effect, a rehearsal for the revelations and recognitions of Easter, even as Easter was itself a model of the end of days. Twelfth Night thus both mimicked and leavened a larger Christian story. Anyone might be king for a day during holiday time, but only Christ was king when it was over. The holiday games of the Christmas feast season, helped shed light on the festive tones of Shakespeare's play. Indeed, the event of the Epiphany models the process of the plot. The confusions caused by Viola's disguise are unknotted by the arrival of the real thing. In this case, not Christ, but Sebastian. But Sebastian's arrival does not fix Malvolio's problems, even as Malvolio's problem is not caused by Viola's disguise. If Twelfth Night largely proposes a light rather than anxious view of the ways in which the world and our own longings for happiness can mislead us, in this exception to the general festive rule of Shakespeare, Shakespeare asks us to evaluate the nature of our longing more somberly. Not all love delusions are created equally in this play. While most entertain Malvolio's usual disgust, or, at the least, make us uncomfortable, much depends here on the particular performance's choices, he is not included in the harmonious couplings at the ending of the ending. Indeed, he presents a conspicuous obstacle to their resolution. Interestingly, the only element of the play's plot noted in Manningham's record of the 1602 Candlemas performance concerns Malvolio's plight, as if it alone stood out in his memory. A good practice in it to make the steward believe his lady widow was in love with him. In Malvolio's ungainly experience of love, the play asks us to ponder the difference between a love delusion that is merely silly or even endearing and one that is grotesque. Olivia's love for Cesario Viola, for instance, is funny and slightly risque. Orsino's for Olivia is fashionable but harmless enough. Viola's for Orsino perhaps a bit perplexing, given what we know of her and she of him. Antonio's for Sebastian is helplessly self-sacrificing, but Malvolio's love for Olivia is ridiculous and verges on the repugnant. Our reaction to Malvolio cannot merely be a matter of our distaste for social climbing, a distaste that the play gives voice to in Olivia's own reluctance to wed above her station. For we are meant, I think, to cheer on Maria's match to Sir Toby as a Cinderella story, a parable of wit rewarded with social elevation. The same goes for Viola and Orsino. One category of longing, that of Olivia, Orsino, Viola, and Antonio, represents an error we perhaps share or forgive, but the other is one we would disown. Our response to the one is sheepish, the other shameful. This double response demonstrates Shakespeare's indebtedness in Twelfth Night to two kinds of comedy, one inclusive in its mockery, the kind we laugh with, and the kind that is satirical and scapegoating, the kind we laugh at. Scholars of Twelfth Night have in fact long been divided as to whether the play represents Shakespeare at the peak of his frivolous best, or heading mordantly towards the problem comedies such as All's Well Ends Well and Measure for Measure. In many respects, Malvolio's longing fits the same profile as the others. It is no more wilful than Olivia's or Orsino's. It is no more hopeless than Antonio's. And like Olivia or Viola, Malvolio loves somebody in love with somebody else. The overlapping spellings of their names enforces the comparison. It is an instance of seeking to love above his station, and Olivia's punctiliousness on this score perhaps sets the certain standard of decorum. But in that case, Viola's love for Orsino is an overreaching one. Since if the Duke Orsino is too high for the Countess Olivia, he is for the mere gentlewoman Viola as well. So, we cannot account for Malvolio's lack of appeal in those terms alone. It's also difficult to charge him on other accounts. There is something unsavoury in Malvolio's alphabetical speculations on Olivia's genitals and great P's, but, to be fair, so is there in Orsino's musings on Cesario's pipe and lips, although the latter is immediately less categorical and urological. Malvolio is a hypocrite, a spoilsport of others' pleasures, who nonetheless cannot refrain from entertaining his own fantasies and sensual indulgences. His very name means ill will. Even more damning, he is a stander upon ceremony who hopes to overleap it by marrying his mistress. But if he is a hypocrite, so in some sense is his mistress. Even Olivia's exorbitant mourning has a kind of hedonism to it. She plans to luxuriate in it. On these scores, Malvolio seems fairly typical of the play's lovers, and indeed of most human beings, somewhat self-absorbed, somewhat self-deceived, prey to the desire to love and be loved in return. Why then is his chastisement so much more severe than theirs? Why does Malvolio alone suffer the humiliation of the dark house scene and the imputation that he is mad? The true indignity for a man who prides himself on self-control. Wouldn't the humiliation of error, having worn yellow cross-garters, and incessant smiling, be enough? If added to the knowledge that his beloved, for whom he has done things so grossly out of character, does not love him in return, indeed, barely considers him a sexual being. Most of us at one time or another love somebody who doesn't love us back, making fools of ourselves in the process. But that ought to argue for our sympathy with this character, not our disdain. Instead, we feel shame, both at the spectacle of his desire, and then at the scene of his humiliation. Indeed, one of the confusing things about the figure of Malvolio is that while we want to see him punished, The punishment itself makes us squirm. Something separates Malvolio's longing from those of the other characters. Part of it is his certainty about his goals. Mariah's forged letters plays upon pre-existing daydreams about Olivia's favour. The nakedness and presumption of his hopes are the first source of our discomfort, and even more damning is the fact that, once encouraged, he does not have the grace to admit doubt or failure. In this, he is so unlike Viola, but not that different from Olivia or Orsino. This confidence is what is most unsettling. The pure and puritanical in the religious sense, Malvolio is not so much a killjoy, though he is that too, as someone convinced without a doubt, unwilling to acknowledge the provisional quality of rewards of his own desert, and certain he is better than others, or that he will be soon enough. So part of what galls about Malvolio, and what we too want to see punished, is his utter conviction of his own rightness. He is a kind of Puritan in his certainty of his own worth, that he will get what he deserves, and deserves what he gets. These are dangerous premises in human loving, Christian salvation, and social mobility alike, but again not necessarily atypical assumptions for any human. A more compelling reason for his lack of appeal may lie in the nature of the object for which he longs. His erotic daydreams are not so much about sex, but about power, and have mostly to do with the political degradation of others. It is not so much Olivia's soul or even body that he desires, but her social position. In his sex fantasy, he leaves her sleeping in a daybed. Only aristocrats get to go to bed in the daytime, in order to lecture her uncle about his behaviour, so that the climax of Malvolio's erotic fantasy is not his own ejaculation, but Sir Toby's curtsy. It galls him sorely that people better born do not need to behave as well as he does, a self-made man who can't afford to misbehave. He chafes against his own subordination to persons lighter in comportment, if heavier in social worth. While we may sympathise with his subjection, it is not clear he would do so were the positions reversed. Malvolio's erotic ambitions are part Cinderella story, but part revenge fantasy. Again, social ambition is not unique to Malvolio. Maria has herself apparently been practising Olivia's handwriting, but what is unique to him is, and what the incongruity of the Cinderella metaphor brings forth, is the peculiar role gender plays in Malvolio's attempts at social elevation, and how its presence reveals the terrible and even terrifying dependency of his position. If Malvolio were to marry up, he would be a man who owed his new position to a woman. Viola and Maria both marry up in this play, but we are used to thinking of women as socially dependent. Men, so dependent, appear in a significantly different light. The humiliating and emasculating nature of Malvolio's situation was not unfamiliar position for male courtiers of Elizabeth I, themselves subordinate and to and dependent on a powerfully socially superior female. This play seems to propose a tolerant shrug, what you will, when it comes to the gender assignment of most coupling, boy and boy, girl and girl, boy and girl, whatever you please. And a similar leniency is extended to the case of the man marrying beneath himself, Sir Toby and Orsino. But Malvolio's situation forces us to confront the fact that anything does not go when it comes to all possible combinations of social ranks and gender roles. Theologically speaking, dependency was the correct relation of the helpless soul to the selective generosity of a Protestant God. However, the radically feminine nature of this dependency made an uncomfortable posture to assume, as the holy sonnets of the poet John Donne make clear. The vulnerability of Malvolio's longing is one we do anything to avoid acknowledging or sharing. Thus, what Malvolio's case forces us to realise is that we too are snobs. Even worse, we are sexist snobs. In consenting to the comic resolution offered by this play, one which excludes him, we must confront our own desires for exclusivity, and the way in which, being chosen, even if it's to be a member of a big and relatively inclusive group, suitably chastised, well-born romantic lovers of heterosexual objects, means that some people must also be excluded from that group. Otherwise, the category of the chosen has no meaning. The chorus to Shakespeare's Henry V addresses the audience as gentles all. If Twelfth Night had a chorus, it would likely speak to gentles only. Malvolio, therefore, is a scapegoat, someone required to bear the sins of the community. Unlike some scapegoats, however, he is one who refuses to go quietly, and who hence shames us with our own need for a scapegoat, who makes us confront our own elitism and the limits of our own comic tolerance. Twelfth Night ends oddly for a comedy. While as a meditation on the common and comic failings of the human nature, it is often profound, it is not a play that strives to establish much psychic specificity in its characters, and hence it forgoes a sense of deep compatibility in its romantic pairings. Even by Shakespeare's standards, there is a fair degree of arbitrariness in the final couplings. Some historians have argued that the play demonstrates the early modern sense that the difference between men and women were a matter of degree rather than opposition. Others have argued that it demonstrates the Renaissance conviction that gender identity was established purely at the level of social signs, that clothes alone can make the man or woman. But while Orsino may segue easily enough from homoerotic affection to heterosexual union, Olivia, who thinks she is marrying the eloquent and effacing speaker of the Willow Cabinet Lament, has in fact betrothed herself to a swordsman capable of blooding the brow of her kinsman, who conspicuously lacks the humanity of his twin sister when it comes to a conviction of his own lovability. Sebastian takes Olivia's love for him for granted, much in the same way as he does Antonio's. There is something brutal here. Other contradictions of comic harmony persist. Viola's woman's weeds are still held hostage in the possession of her sea captain, himself mysteriously imprisoned by a Malvolio not likely to be mollified any time soon, absent an ability to laugh at himself. Antonio is, we hope, going to be allowed to live, if not as part of the nuptial congress. The most authentic emotional resolution of the play lies less with the union of sexual partners than the awkward reunion of siblings. For while both kinds of union work to defeat death, the death defeated by the return of the lost sibling, who in turn recalls and repairs the death of a parent, is the death less capable of being redressed through procreation. Shakespeare may satisfy comic form and expectations here, but he does so mockingly, almost with a kind of contempt, giving us what we will, but forcing us to acknowledge the stubbornness of our desire for tidy endings and what we are willing to sacrifice for them. Right, so I hope you found that it's a very dense and fairly complex introduction to the play, but having read the play, you'll probably get a sense of some of the characters from that. And the intention of sharing it is so that you have been exposed to, I guess, an interpretation. There's obviously a very clear interpretation of Malvolio. There's a clear interpretation of the play's themes based around the religious context of the time in which it was written. There's a clear interpretation offered about the way the play ends. So you're being exposed to a whole range of interpretations, and wide reading is meant to do that. It's meant to expose them to you. But you don't have to accept them. You can challenge them. You can disagree. But remember that when you do that, you must have reasons for doing so that are based in your understanding and close reading of the text. All right, so there we are, 40 minutes of wider reading, and now some more activities for you to go on with.